My daughter turned off my soap opera and told her husband that this was why she wanted me gone, that I contributed nothing. My name is Martha. I am 71 years old and I am a widow. What she did not know was that this trash paid for this house. The living room clock had just struck 7. For me, that was the sacred hour. Not dinner time, not time for evening prayers. It was time for Crossed Loves, my favorite show. I had been waiting months for it. The commercials promised one of those dramas that grab your heart and do not let go. A story of a woman who loses everything and fights to get it back. I felt so identified with it. I had also fought my whole life. The difference was that I felt my struggle was already over, and now I only had this small pleasure left. Sitting on the sofa that my Richard and I bought 40 years ago, covering myself with the wool blanket I knitted when my hands did not ache so much, and getting lost in the lives of others. That Tuesday, the house smelled like orange pound cake. I had baked it in the afternoon, thinking of my daughter Grace and her husband Frank. Frank loved it. He always seemed like a young man in too much of a hurry, the kind who looks at his watch every 5 minutes as if the world were going to end. But when he ate my cake, for a moment, he looked like a little boy again. That small detail made me happy, feeling that I could still give them something, even if it was just a small piece of something sweet. The evening light came through the dining room window, dyeing the walls a calm, golden color. I had my crackers on a plate, a steaming cup of chamomile tea on the little table, and the remote control in my hand. Everything was in its place. The world could fall apart outside, but in my living room, at 7 in the evening, everything was in perfect peace. The intro music of the show began to play, a dramatic melody full of violins that gave me goosebumps. I settled better into the sofa, sinking into the cushions that already had the shape of my body, and smiled. It was my moment, a small luxury that I felt I had earned after 50 years of relentless work. 1 hour for me, just for me. That house was not a luxury. It was the map of my life. Every brick had a story. Richard and I bought this lot when there was nothing here but open fields and promises. He was a bricklayer, one of the good ones, the kind who knew how to read the land. I was a seamstress, but not just any seamstress. I worked for the big department stores downtown, the ones that sold party dresses that cost what we earned in 3 months. Nobody knew my name, but my hands dressed the richest brides in the city. While Richard raised the walls by day, I sewed by night. I remember the constant humming of my Singer sewing machine, an inheritance from my mother, mixing with the sound of the crickets. Grace slept in her crib, oblivious to everything. Everything was for her, so she could have a solid roof over her head, so she could go to college, so she would not have to spend sleepless nights with pricked fingers and a stiff back. We saved every penny. There were no vacations, no dinners out, no new clothes for years. Our only joy was watching the house grow, slowly but surely. First a bedroom and a bathroom, then the kitchen. Years later, the living room. When Grace turned 15, Richard finished the 2nd floor. "So my princess can have her castle," he used to say, with his eyes shining with pride and his hands covered in cement. He passed away 10 years ago. One bad day, his heart, so big and so strong, simply got tired of beating. He left me alone in the house we had built together, but he did not leave me helpless. He left me the house, paid off to the last cent, and a small pension that, added to my sewing jobs, allowed me to live without luxuries, but with dignity. When Grace married Frank, I insisted they stay and live with me. "The house is too big for just one person," I told them. Besides, they could save on rent and put money away for their own place. In my head, it was the logical thing to do. We were family, and family takes care of each other. At first, everything went well, but little by little, I started to feel like an old piece of furniture, a silent nuisance. They stopped asking for my opinion. They started moving things around without consulting me. The vase Richard gave me was put away in a closet because it did not match their style. My embroidered tablecloths were replaced by more practical plastic ones. I did not say anything. I swallowed my sadness and smiled. At my age, you learn that some battles are not worth fighting. Or so I thought. The front door swung open, shattering the peace of my living room. It was them. Grace threw her purse on the dining room chair with a sigh of annoyance. Frank walked in behind her, talking on his phone, with a scowl on his face. Not a hello, Mom, not a how are you doing? Nothing. They walked right past me as if I were invisible, just another part of the scenery. I shrank a little on my sofa, as if trying to take up less space. Frank hung up his phone and dropped into the other armchair. "What is for dinner?" he asked without looking at me as he opened his laptop. "I made a pound cake," I started to say, but Grace cut me off. She stood in front of the television, blocking my view. "Are you still watching that trash, Mom?" she said, in a tone that was a mix of pity and disgust. Before I could answer, she grabbed the remote control from the small table and with a sharp gesture turned off the TV. The silence that followed was louder than the violins from the show. The screen went black, reflecting my surprised face, and hers with a smirk of superiority. She turned to her husband, who kept typing without looking up, and dropped the sentence that pierced my chest like an ice-cold knife. "See? This is why I want her gone. She spends all day watching trash and contributes nothing. Nothing at all." Contributes nothing. The words echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls that my husband and I had built with our own hands. Frank, without taking his eyes off his screen, made a vague gesture with his hand. "Come on, Grace, leave her alone." But there was no defense in his voice, only indifference. To complete the humiliation, he reached over to set his laptop on the small table where I had my tea and crackers. Since it did not fit, he used the back of his hand to push my knitting basket, which fell to the floor with a dull thud. My yarn, my needles, and my little sewing kit scattered across the rug, and my silver thimble, the one my mother gave me, rolled away and got lost under the sofa. Neither of them even flinched. Grace went to the kitchen, I suppose to look for the cake that the woman who contributes nothing had baked for them. Frank kept typing, and I stayed there perfectly still on my sofa, in my living room, in my house, feeling like a stranger, like trash. I was paralyzed, not out of anger, not at first. It was a kind of coldness that started in my feet and crept up my entire body until it reached my heart. A coldness of pure loneliness, of realizing that to my own daughter, I was no longer a person. I was a problem, an object taking up space. I could hear their voices from the kitchen, talking about work, their plans for the weekend, buying a new car. Their lives went on, loud and full of important things, while mine had been turned off with a simple click. I did not move from the sofa for I do not know how long. Grace walked by with a slice of cake in her hand, sat next to her husband, and they started watching something together on the computer, laughing quietly. Not a single glance my way, not a single word. The woman who had fed them, washed their clothes, and given them a roof over their heads, was sitting just 10 feet away, broken inside, and to them, it was as if she did not exist. When they finally got up to go to their room, Grace told me from the doorway, "Mom, do not make lunch tomorrow, we are eating out." She did not wait for an answer. They went up the stairs and I heard the click of their bedroom door closing. Their private world, right inside my house. The house fell silent again, but it was no longer a sacred peace. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. I looked at the black television screen. My own reflection stared back at me. A little old lady with white hair, shrunk down on a sofa that was too big. Is that what I had become? A burden? Tears began to stream down my cheeks, slow and silent. I was not crying over the show. I was crying over the lack of respect. I was crying for Richard, because if he were here, he would have never allowed anyone to treat me like this. He always said my hands were magical, that they turned simple fabrics into dreams. To my daughter, those same hands contributed nothing anymore. I did not sleep that night. I tossed and turned in bed, with Grace's words drilling into my head. contributes nothing. I got up in the early hours of the morning and went down to the kitchen. I sat in the dark, in the exact same chair where I used to sit with Richard to drink coffee before he left for the construction site. I could almost feel his presence, his large, rough hand over mine. "What do I do, my old man?" I asked the empty air. "What do I do?" The next morning, I woke up before them. I moved through the house like a ghost. I made their coffee, just like always. I left the bread and jam on the table, just like always. They came down, served themselves, ate in a rush, and left. "Bye, Mom," they tossed into the air without even looking at me. The door closed and the silence returned. But this time it was different. The coldness from the night before had turned into something hard, something solid inside me. There were no more tears, only a strange calm, a clarity that was almost frightening. I knelt in the living room, my body aching, and reached my hand under the sofa. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. It was my silver thimble. I pulled it out and held it in the palm of my hand. It was dented on one side, worn down by thousands and thousands of stitches, the symbol of my life, of my work, of every silent sacrifice I had made for my daughter. Looking at that tiny object brought my strength back. This was not the end. My story was not over. I was not trash. I was the owner of this house. I walked over to the telephone in the hallway, that old rotary phone that Frank always said we needed to throw away. I searched through the old, worn, yellow pages in my house. I dialed a number. I waited. On the other end, a young, professional voice said, "Lawson Locksmith, good morning." I took a deep breath. My voice, when it came out, sounded firm, firmer than it had felt in years. "Good morning," I said. "I need someone to come and change all the locks on a house. Yes, all of them. Can you come today?" I hung up the phone and stood for a moment with my hand on the receiver, as if the cold plastic could calm the trembling I felt inside. It was not fear. It was the vibration of an engine that had been stopped for a long time and was suddenly starting up again. The man from the locksmith shop, a Mr. Lawson, had told me he would send someone in less than an hour. At my age, you learn to read voices over the phone. His was honest. I sat in one of the dining room chairs, the one at the head of the table, Richard's chair. Since he passed away, no one sat there. It was an empty throne. But that morning, I felt I had the right to claim it. I looked at the living room. The morning light came in differently, harsher, without the warmth of the evening. It revealed the dust in the corners, the small scratches on the hardwood floor. It revealed the truth. The house was waiting. I was waiting. The doorbell rang right on time 45 minutes later. I opened the door and found a young man who could not have been older than 25. He carried a toolbox in one hand and had a shy smile on his face. "Good morning, ma'am. I am Mike, from Lawson Locksmith." I let him in. While he got to work on the front door, I watched him from the kitchen doorway. The sound of his tools was methodical, precise. The screech of the old metal being taken apart. The satisfying click of the new locks snapping into place. Every sound was a stitch closing an old wound. Mike was quiet and respectful. When he finished with the front door, he handed me a set of new, shiny, sharp keys. "This is for the front," he said. "Now I will move on to the back door and the patio gate." I nodded in silence. He moved through my house with a quiet efficiency, without asking questions, without curious glances. It was just a job for him. For me, it was a revolution. While Mike worked on the kitchen door that led to the patio, I went up to the second floor. I went straight to the room I used as my sewing studio. It was the smallest room, the one with the best light. I opened the closet, and in the back, behind some boxes filled with fabric scraps, there was an old wooden trunk. I kept the key in my sewing kit next to the colored spools of thread. I opened it. The smell of mothballs and memories hit me softly. Inside, there were no wedding dresses or party gowns. There were notebooks, dozens of ledger notebooks, the cheap kind with cardboard covers. I started taking them out one by one. Every page was filled with my tight handwriting, dates, names, descriptions, and figures. Mrs. Miller, maid of honor dress, pearl embroidery, $300. The Vance family, baptism gown, Brussels lace, $500. Bride, Miss Angelina, silk tulle veil with crystal appliques, $1,200. These were from 30-40 years ago. Back then, that amount of money was a fortune. Richard was an honest man, and his entire bricklayer salary went straight into the bank passbook, plain for everyone to see, for the house, for groceries, for Grace's education. But my work was different. My clients, the wealthy ladies from the city, preferred to pay me in cash. Just so we do not bother my husband with these little things, Martha, you understand. Of course I understood them. And that money, that river of cash that flowed through my pricked hands, never made it into the family bank book. Richard and I had a pact. "This is your money, Martha," he told me one night while I was counting a stack of bills by the light of a small lamp. "It is the fruit of your hands, of your art. Keep it for yourself, for your things, for your old age." And so I did. I opened another account, one solely in my name, at a bank downtown that no one else in the family used. Every week for over 40 years, I deposited a portion of those earnings, without fail. Grace never knew about this. To her, I was just Mom, the one who sews. She had no idea the true value of my work. She did not know that while her father was raising walls, I was funding the luxury finishes, the imported bathroom tiles, the bronze kitchen faucets, the oak hardwood floors in the living room. She believed it had all come from her father's paycheck. I let her believe it. It was simpler that way. Now, looking at those notebooks, I understood that my power was not just in the deed to this house. It was in those pages. It was in a savings account that had been quietly accumulating interest for 30 years. I was not the woman who contributes nothing. I was the invisible foundation of everything they took for granted. When I went downstairs, Mike was already finishing up with the last lock on the patio gate. The mid-morning sun flooded the kitchen. I offered him a glass of cold water. He drank it in one gulp, looking grateful. "All done, Mrs. Martha," he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Everything is changed out. Here are the other 2 sets of keys." He handed me 3 identical keychains. On each one, 3 silver keys. They felt heavy in my hand, solid, real. I paid him what he asked for, plus a little extra. "For your kindness, young man," I told him. He tried to decline, but I insisted. When he left, I closed the front door. The sound of the new deadbolt turning was music to my ears. A clean, definitive sound. I stood right in the middle of the living room. The silence was absolute. And then I began. I walked over to the corner where Frank had piled up my things to set up his portable workstation. With a calmness that surprised even myself, I unplugged his laptop, his printer, and that tangled mess of cords that had always bothered me. I packed it all carefully into his computer bag. Then I went to the hallway closet, pulled out an empty cardboard box, and began packing away his things. His business magazines, his folders, the digital picture frame that displayed photos of their beach vacations. The ones I was never invited to, I packed everything, not with anger, but with the precision of a surgeon. Next, I went to the coffee table, the one he had roughly cleared by knocking over my knitting basket. I lifted the practical plastic tablecloth that Grace had bought. Underneath, the oak wood that Richard and I had polished for years seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. I went to the linen trunk and took out one of my own tablecloths, a hand-embroidered one with a sunflower design. I spread it out over the table. The stitches were perfect. The silk thread still shined. After that, I carried the box with Frank's belongings up to their room and left it neatly beside his side of the bed. It was not an act of war. It was a reassignment of space. On my way down, I stopped in front of the cabinet where Grace had hidden the vase Richard gave me for our wedding anniversary. I opened it. There it was, sitting in the back, gathering dust. I took it out, wiped it down with my apron until the cut crystals sparkled again, and placed it dead center on the small table with the sunflower tablecloth. The morning sun reflected off its facets, filling the room with tiny rainbows. The house was mine once more. I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside, to breathe some fresh air. I draped a shawl over my shoulders and stepped out into the small front yard. My rose bushes needed pruning. As I was snipping away some dead branches, I heard a voice. "Miss Martha, so good to see you." It was Helen, my next-door neighbor. She is a young woman, a lawyer, who lives with her 2 little kids. She had always been very kind to me. She walked up to the low fence that separated our properties. "Your roses are looking more beautiful than ever this year," she told me with a genuine smile. "That is because I talk to them a lot," I replied, and we both laughed. "And how are Grace and Frank? I have not seen them around much," she asked. "They are doing well, just working a lot. You know how young people are," I answered, managing a neutral tone that took an enormous amount of effort. Helen sighed. "Yes, that is just how life is nowadays. But they are so lucky to have you and to live in this house. I always tell my husband that this is the prettiest house on the block. You can tell it was built with love. Mr. Richard was an artist with bricks." I felt a lump form in my throat. Having someone, an outsider, see and recognize the love and hard work poured into those walls, it was like a soothing balm. "He adored you, you know," Helen continued, lowering her voice. "Whenever he talked about you, his face would light up. He used to say, 'My Martha has fairy hands. She turns rags into treasures.'" What a man. I was left speechless. All I could do was smile, a shaky, fragile smile. "Thank you, Helen. Thank you for reminding me of that." "You have nothing to thank me for, Miss Martha. It is the honest truth." She said goodbye because one of her kids was calling her from inside. I went back to my rose bushes, but I no longer saw the thorns. I saw Richard's face glowing. I saw my hands, not as the hands of a useless old woman, but as fairy hands. Hands that turn rags into treasures. And they also turn pennies into independence. The house phone started ringing. I went inside to answer. It was Grace. Her voice sounded rushed, as always. "Mom, are you there?" "Yes, honey, I am here." "Did you eat lunch yet? Look, do not forget to water the balcony plants. They are going to dry out in this sun. And Frank wanted me to ask if his Amazon package arrived. It is important." Not a "how are you doing?" Not a "do you need anything?" Just instructions, orders, a to-do list for the unpaid maid. I took a deep breath. Helen's voice was still echoing in my ears. "Yes, honey, do not worry," I said, and my voice sounded so calm that I even surprised myself. "Oh, all right, I will call you later, bye." And she hung up. I stood there staring at the phone. The calm I felt was freezing, as sharp as the crystal on Richard's vase. Frank's package was by the front door. I picked it up and placed it next to the box of his things, upstairs in his room. The balcony plants could keep waiting. The next morning, I woke up at the crack of dawn, but not to make their coffee. I took a long shower and got dressed. Not in my usual robe, but in an off-white linen-tailored suit I had made for myself 20 years ago for a wedding. It fit me perfectly. I opened my jewelry box and put on the pearl earrings that Richard had given me. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was not a shriveled little old lady. It was Martha, the seamstress, the owner of her own life. I grabbed my leather handbag, the one I only used for special occasions. Inside it, I put my wallet, the new sets of keys, and in a zippered pocket, my silver thimble. I stepped out of the house, locking the door with a firm, decisive click. I did not take a cab. I walked to the bus stop just as I had done for so many years to head downtown and deliver my work. The ride felt short. The city had changed, but some things remained exactly the same. The noise, the rush, the feeling that anything was possible. I got off right in front of the First National Bank building. It was an old, imposing structure with marble columns and heavy bronze doors. I walked inside. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper and money. I walked up to one of the desks. "Good morning," I said to the young woman sitting behind it. "I would like to speak to the branch manager." The girl peered up at me over her glasses. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I do not," I answered calmly. "But tell him that Martha Rivers would like to speak with him regarding her savings account, number 7458-22. The young woman typed the number into her computer. Her eyes widened just a fraction more than normal. "One moment, please, Mrs. Rivers. Please have a seat." I did not wait more than 5 minutes. A man in a sharp gray suit, with his hair slicked back, walked out of a wood-paneled office. "Mrs. Rivers, I am Albert Davis, the branch manager. Please come right in." His office was spacious with a large window overlooking the city square. He offered me some coffee. I accepted. I sat down in a plush leather chair that sank softly under my weight. "Tell me, how can I help you today? I see your account has not had any activity in quite some time. It is actually one of our oldest active accounts." I pulled the old savings passbook from my handbag. The cover was worn, but the figures inside were perfectly clear. I handed it to him. Mr. Davis opened it carefully as if it were a rare artifact. He flipped through the pages, his eyebrows creeping higher and higher. "This is incredibly impressive, Mrs. Rivers. The original principal, plus the compound interest over all these years, it amounts to a very, very substantial sum." I nodded. "I know, and I want to make a few changes." My voice did not waver. I gave him my instructions, clear and precise. I wanted to close out that old account and transfer every last penny into a brand new checking account, in my name and my name only. I wanted a debit card, a checkbook, and access to online banking. And I also wanted to make a withdrawal, in cold hard cash, an amount large enough that it would feel heavy in my purse, but not so large that it would draw unnecessary attention. The manager did not even blink. He gave the orders over the phone with flawless efficiency. Half an hour later, I was holding a fresh folder with all my paperwork, a gleaming new debit card, and a thick, bulging envelope tucked safely inside my handbag. As we said our goodbyes, Mr. Davis walked me all the way to the door. "It has been an absolute pleasure, Mrs. Rivers. If you ever need anything, please do not hesitate to call me directly." I shook his hand. His grip was firm and deeply respectful. I walked out of the bank and stood at the top of the marble steps. The midday sun hit me right in the face. The noise of the city wrapped around me. I slipped my hand into my purse and felt the envelope filled with cash, and right beside it, the cold metal of my thimble. It was not just money, it was independence, it was power. It was undeniable proof that I, Martha, had always contributed. And now, my daughter and her husband were about to find out exactly how much. I did not go straight home. With my handbag resting heavily in my lap, I asked a cab driver to take me downtown, to the main avenue. I got off right in front of Sun Galleries, the most expensive department store in the entire city. The exact same store for which I had sewn dozens of bridal gowns without my name ever once appearing on a single label. I walked through the revolving glass doors, and the icy blast of the air conditioning welcomed me like a round of applause. Everything smelled of expensive perfume and brand new luxury. I strolled down the marble aisles, completely ignoring the saleswomen who watched me with open curiosity. I went straight to the home decor department. I stopped in front of a curtain display. They were made of raw silk, a deep midnight blue, like the sky right before dawn, heavy and opulent. Just touching them felt like a luxury. Grace had always complained that my old white linen curtains gathered too much dust and looked like they belonged in a hospital room. I walked up to a salesman. "I want 4 panels of these drapes," I said, pointing to the blue ones. "And I will also take the solid brass rods that hold them." The young man looked me up and down, quietly evaluating my tailored linen suit and my pearl earrings. "Of course, ma'am," he said, instantly shifting his expression to one of polished professional service. "I assume you would like these scheduled for delivery?" "No, I replied. I am taking them with me right now. I paid with a thick stack of bills straight from the envelope the bank gave me. Watching the salesman's face as he counted the cash was my first little pleasure of the day. I walked out of the store carrying 2 large, heavy shopping bags. It was not just fabric. It was a statement. My house was no longer going to be merely practical and functional. It was going to be beautiful, done to my exact taste. Instead of hailing another cab, I walked the few blocks that separated downtown from my neighborhood. I needed to feel the weight of those bags in my hands, to feel the warm sun on my face. When I reached my street, I saw Helen, my neighbor, taking out the trash. She waved at me. Instead of walking past her, I crossed the street and walked right up to her front gate. "Helen, good morning," I said. "Miss Martha, you look so elegant today. Is there a special occasion?" Her smile was so sincere that it completely disarmed any remaining doubts I might have had. "Yes, there is," I told her. "I am putting my life in order, and I wanted to ask you for some advice as a lawyer." Her expression changed immediately. She became serious and attentive. She invited me into her small front yard. We sat down on a wrought iron bench in the shade of a lemon tree. I told her everything, not the part about the money, not just yet. I told her about the soap opera, my daughter's cruel words, my knitting basket knocked to the floor, my lost silver thimble. I told her exactly how invisible I had felt inside my own home. I spoke with a calmness I did not even know I possessed, without a single tear, laying out the facts as if it were a case file belonging to someone else. Helen listened without interrupting, nodding every now and then with a look of deep understanding. When I finally finished, she sat in silence for a moment. "I am so incredibly sorry you are going through this, Martha," she said at last. Her voice was gentle, yet very firm. "What your daughter and your son-in-law are doing is not just cruel. It is abuse, emotional abuse, and from what you are telling me about how they are treating your property, it borders on financial elder abuse." The word abuse hit me hard. I had just been calling it a lack of respect, pure ingratitude, but she gave it its true name, its legal name. "I had all the locks changed this morning," I confessed to her. Helen raised an eyebrow, and a small, proud smile appeared on her lips. "Well done," she said. "That is the absolute best first step. The house is entirely in your name, correct? On the original deed?" "It is in my name, and the name of my late husband," I confirmed. "Then you are the sole and absolute owner. You have every right in the world to decide who is allowed inside and who is not." "I know that," I told her. "But when they get home and realize they cannot get in, they are going to say that I am just a crazy old lady, that I am going senile, that I have no idea what I am doing. They will try to take away my control." Helen nodded, already anticipating my exact concern. "That is the classic playbook. But we are going to be one step ahead of them. Come to my law office first thing tomorrow morning. We will draft up the proper paperwork, a preventative power of attorney and a living will. We will put all your wishes down in writing, stating clearly that you are in full possession of your mental faculties, and we will even have it certified by a geriatric doctor friend of mine. Any attempt they make to declare you incompetent will crash straight into a solid, concrete, legal wall, the very wall you built to protect yourself." I felt a massive, crushing weight lift right off my shoulders. "Thank you so much, Helen. I do not even know how I can possibly repay you." "Do not even worry about that right now," she said, gently placing her hand over mine. "Consider this a free consultation between friendly neighbors. And one more thing, Martha. When they show up, if they get aggressive or threaten you in any way, do not hesitate to call me immediately or call the police directly. You are not alone in this." I said goodbye with a level of gratitude that words could not even capture. My armor was fully in place. I got back home and immediately got to work. I took down those old linen curtains, folded them up very carefully, and packed them away in a box. Maybe they could still be of use to someone else. Then, with the help of a small stepladder, I installed the brand new brass curtain rods. It was hard work, My arms are certainly not what they used to be, but every single screw I tightened felt like a firm reaffirmation of my own willpower. Finally, I hung those heavy panels of midnight blue silk. The late afternoon sunlight filtered right through them, casting a magical, serene atmosphere across the entire living room. Richard's crystal vase, sitting proudly on the sunflower tablecloth, looked like a precious jewel resting inside a treasure chest. The house had changed. It was breathing differently now. It smelled clean, brand new, and full of fierce determination. I brought my old black Singer sewing machine down from my studio upstairs and set it up right in a corner of the dining room. It had not been down there in years. Its heavy black and gold presence felt just like having a dear old friend come back home. I set down my blue knitting basket with all my colorful yarns perfectly organized beside it. Then I prepared dinner, but this time not for 3 people, just for 1. I made a hearty vegetable soup, just the way Richard always loved it, along with a crisp side salad. I set the dining table with my absolute best china, the set that Grace always complained was far too fragile for everyday use. I set out a single plate, a single set of silverware, and 1 elegant glass. When the sun finally began to set, I went out and sat down in the wooden rocking chair I had pulled out onto the front porch. I poured myself a tall glass of ice water with a slice of lemon, and I waited. The evening air was warm, and the sweet scent of my blooming roses filled the twilight. I watched the other neighbors pulling into their driveways after work, kids playing games out in the street. It was an incredibly peaceful scene, the perfect calm right before the storm. But I was not afraid. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I heard the familiar hum of Frank's car engine turning the corner. My heart gave a tiny little jump in my chest, but my hands stayed perfectly steady as I held my glass of water. They parked the car right in front of the house. I watched them step out. Grace was laughing at some joke he was telling her. They were wrapped up in their own little world, a world where I was nothing more than an annoying satellite orbiting around them. They walked up the small stone pathway leading to the front door. They completely failed to notice me. I was sitting right there in the shadows of the porch, as still as a statue. Frank jammed his key straight into the deadbolt. The harsh metallic scrape of the wrong key hitting the brand new lock mechanism was sharp, loud, and incredibly final. He frowned. He pulled it out, glared at the key, as if it were somehow to blame, and shoved it right back in. He tried to force it a little. Nothing. "That is weird," I heard him mutter under his breath. "The lock must be jammed or something." Grace, completely impatient as always, snatched the keys right out of his hand. "Here, let me try. You are always so rough with things." She tried with a bit more finesse, wiggling it gently from side to side. The result was exactly the same. That heavy door did not budge a single inch. Her impatience quickly turned into pure irritation. "What is wrong with this stupid piece of junk?" "Mom, are you in there?" she yelled toward the house. "The front door is jammed." They started knocking, first just with their knuckles, and then pounding with the flat palms of their hands. The heavy thuds echoed against the solid wood. I just stayed in my rocking chair, not moving a single muscle, quietly watching them. I let them pound on the door a few more times, letting their frustration build until it turned into very visible anger. Finally, right as Frank was winding up to bash the door with a closed fist, I spoke up. My voice was calm and collected, but it completely sliced right through the evening air. "Good afternoon." They spun around so fast it was as if they had just seen a ghost. They stared at me with wide eyes, utterly confused. It took them several long seconds to process the fact that I had been sitting right there all along, barely 15 feet away. "Mom, what on earth are you doing just sitting there? We cannot get inside." Grace snapped, her voice high-pitched and agitated. "The lock is completely broken." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. "The lock works perfectly fine," I replied, looking her dead straight in the eyes. "What is not working is your key." A thick, heavy silence fell over the porch. Frank and Grace looked at each other, and then they slowly turned to look back at me. The sheer confusion written across their faces was almost comical. "What do you mean our key does not work?" Frank asked, taking a step toward the porch. "Did you change it?" "Yes," I said simply. "You changed it?" Grace repeated, and her voice went up an octave, turning into a screech. "Can we know why you would do something like that without consulting us? This is our house." I got up from the rocking chair, slowly. I leaned on the porch railing and looked down at them. The slight height of the steps gave me an advantage that was not just physical. "That is where you are wrong, Grace," I said, and my voice was no longer that of a submissive little old lady. It was the voice of the absolute owner. "This is not your house. It is my house." Right at that exact moment, as if it were perfectly written in a movie script, the door to Helen's house opened and she stepped outside, carrying a watering can. She started watering some potted plants on her porch, keeping her back to us, but her presence was unmistakable. I had a witness. Grace's anger boiled over. "What is wrong with you? Did you suddenly go crazy? We live here. We have our things in there." "Had," I corrected her calmly. "Your things are packed up in cardboard boxes sitting in what used to be your bedroom. Do not worry, I did not throw them in the trash. I was much more considerate than that." Frank took a heavy step forward, his face flushed red with pure fury. "Is this some kind of joke? What has gotten into you?" "Open the door right now, Mom." "Do not call me Mom in that tone," I warned her. "And no, I am not opening it. As of today, you two do not live here anymore." "This is completely unbelievable," Frank yelled, running his hands frantically through his hair. "After everything we do for you, we give you a solid roof over your head. We take care of you." I laughed. Not a belly laugh, but a dry, hollow laugh, completely devoid of any joy. "You take care of me? You give me a roof over my head? This house, Frank, was built by my husband with his bare hands, and I paid for it with mine, stitch by painful stitch. The roof over your head, the food you have eaten, the electricity you have used, I have paid for all of it, for years, in total silence." Grace tried another tactic. Manipulation. Her eyes instantly filled with crocodile tears. "Mom, please. What did we do to you? Was it because of the soap opera? I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was just really stressed from work. You cannot throw us out on the street over something so silly." "It was not silly, Grace. It was the straw that broke the camel's back," I answered her, completely unmoved by her theatrical performance. "It was the moment I realized that to you, I am just a nuisance, someone who contributes absolutely nothing. And I decided you were right. The woman you knew, the one who put up with everything in total silence, that woman does not contribute anything anymore. It is officially over." Frank angrily yanked his phone out of his pocket. "Enough of this circus. If you do not open the door, I am going to call a locksmith to force it open, and if not, I will call the cops." "Go right ahead," I encouraged him, opening my arms wide in an inviting gesture. "Call whoever you want. Explain to the police officer that you are trying to force your way into your mother-in-law's private property. Show him your key, the one that does not work anymore. Explain to him that the legal owner of the house, which is me, is kindly asking you to leave. It will be a very interesting conversation for everyone involved." He stood there frozen with the phone in his hand, hesitating. He knew I was right. The law was entirely on my side. His face fell apart, his raging anger giving way to a very ugly desperation. "Someone put ideas in your head," he hissed, glaring up at me with pure hatred. "That neighbor of yours, the lawyer, she is manipulating you." "Nobody is manipulating me, Frank. At 71 years old, I am finally thinking for myself, something I really should have done a very long time ago." I turned around, giving them my back, and walked toward the heavy front door of my house. I slid the shiny new key into the lock. It turned with a perfect, satisfying smoothness. I opened the door, and before stepping inside, I turned back around to look at them one last time. They were standing out on the sidewalk, completely defeated, illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp that had just come on for the evening. They looked like two strangers. "You have exactly 1 hour to get a moving truck to pick up your things," I informed them. "I will leave the boxes out on the porch for you. After that, I'm not responsible for what happens to them." I went inside and firmly closed the door. The loud click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most satisfying final period I had heard in my entire life. Only the sound of my beating heart echoed in the now silent, blue-tinted living room. Out there, their silence was incredibly heavy, loaded with pure disbelief. I took a deep breath, inhaling the brand new smell of my house, a crisp blend of fresh silk and lemon cleaner. There was absolutely no time to lose. The single hour I gave them was a generous gift, not a mere suggestion. Armed with an energy I thought I had lost decades ago, I began the massive task. First, I marched upstairs to their bedroom, the unmade bed, clothes left carelessly draped over a chair. That room, which was once Grace's when she was growing up, painted a soft pink by her father, now looked like a cheap hotel room, used by messy strangers. I started packing everything up, not with the wild fury they might have expected from me, but with the strict methodical order of a master seamstress. I separated their clothes, neatly folded Grace's things, and made a separate pile for Frank's. I opened the closets, completely emptied the dressers. My movements were sharp, precise, mechanical. Every object I touched felt completely alien, like a home invasion. Her expensive perfumes, his shiny watches, the towering stacks of self-help books they never seemed to actually read. I placed everything securely into heavy cardboard boxes I kept stored down in the basement. I did not toss anything around. I did not break a single item. I treated their belongings with a level of respect and care that they never once had for my feelings. As I worked, I could hear the constant murmur of their voices outside on the sidewalk, rising in pitch, eventually breaking out into heated arguments. He blamed her. She whimpered back at him. They sounded like two lost little children, but any maternal pity I might have felt was buried deep under heavy layers of sheer disappointment. When I finished clearing out the bedroom, I moved straight onto the bathroom, then to the endless electronic devices that had spread through my house like a digital plague. Every single box I closed up and sealed with packing tape felt exactly like closing a painful chapter of my life. I started carrying them, one by one, out to the front porch. They were very heavy, and my lower back protested the effort. But my sheer determination was a much stronger fuel than the physical pain. I was not just moving boxes. I was violently reclaiming my personal space, inch by inch. They watched me through the glass panels of the front door, moving constantly like a worker ant. The sight of their entire life piled up on the porch finally seemed to break their stubborn spell of denial. Grace rushed up to the door, her face flushed red and swollen from crying. "Mom," she cried out with a choked voice, pressing her hand flat against the cold glass. "Mom, please, open the door. Let us just talk about this. Please do not do this." I did not stop. I continued my work, dragging out yet another heavy box. Frank joined her at the glass, his blind rage quickly replaced by a pathetic mask of fake reason. "Martha," he said, using my first name as if it were some sort of weapon, a cheap way to demote me from a mother figure to an equal. "Just be reasonable. We are a family. Families have problems, but they sit down and solve them together. They do not kick each other out into the street." I ignored them completely. The very last box was the one containing the items from his makeshift desk in my living room. As I set it down on top of the pile, I looked at them directly through the glass. Grace's eyes were full of tears, but now I clearly saw the cold calculation hiding behind them. It was not emotional pain. It was pure panic, the absolute panic of someone who has just had their comfortable safety net violently ripped away. Frank, on the other hand, looked like he was ready to explode. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He stepped away from the door and started pacing furiously back and forth on the sidewalk with his phone pressed hard to his ear. He was calling for backup. I knew the next phase of this was going to get incredibly ugly. I turned back inside, locked the door, and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a cold glass of water. My hands were shaking a little bit, but it was just from the intense physical exertion. Deep inside, my soul was completely at peace. The heavy rumble of a moving truck sounded out on the street, loud and clear. The hour was officially up. I opened the front door and planted myself firmly on the threshold, blocking the entrance to the house with my body. The two movers, burly guys with very unfriendly faces, looked from me to Frank, who was barking, rushed instructions at them. "Just load up these boxes, quickly!" One of the movers looked over at me, clearly confused by the situation. Is the lady of the house actually okay with this? Before I could even answer him, Grace ran up the steps, trying to wrap her arms around me. "Mom, please, just think this through. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? What are all the neighbors going to say?" I pushed her away gently, but with absolute unyielding firmness. "That, Grace, is something you really should have thought about much earlier, before you decided to treat me like a useless piece of junk in my own home." Frank approached the steps, his phone still gripped in his hand. "Enough. I threatened to call the cops earlier, but now I am actually going to do it, and I am calling my lawyer, too. You will see that you cannot legally do this. We have tenant rights." "What rights, Frank?" I asked him, crossing my arms over my chest. "The right to live absolutely rent-free in a house that does not belong to you? The right to constantly humiliate the very person who gave you everything? Show me exactly where that right is written down in the law." He was left utterly speechless, stammering over his own words. We contributed financially. The expensive kitchen remodel, the brand new air conditioning unit in the bedroom. Do you really think all of that just paid for itself?" And there it was. The exact argument I had been waiting for, the precise moment they would try to magically transform themselves from freeloading parasites into noble investors. It was finally time for the first major revelation. "The kitchen remodel," I said, slowly savoring every single word. "Let us talk about that. It cost $10,000, if I remember correctly, money that you two proudly claim to have saved up with so much hard work and sacrifice." "Exactly." Frank jumped in immediately. "That was our big end-of-the-year bonus from work." "How very curious," I continued, with a deadly, icy calm. "Because I have my bank statement right here, from an account you two do not even know exists, showing a withdrawal of exactly $10,000 just 3 days before you handed that cash to the contractor. The exact same timeline applies to the air conditioning unit, and to your little luxury vacation down to the Caribbean last year, and to the expensive repairs on your car, Frank, 6 months ago." The silence that followed was completely absolute. Even the burly movers stopped dead in their tracks, watching the scene unfold as if it were the dramatic season finale of a television show. Grace slowly looked over at Frank, and Frank stared straight down at the concrete. All the color completely drained from both of their faces. They had absolutely no idea. They always thought my only source of income was my late husband's small pension. The cash I handed them every now and then to help out with household expenses. They saw it as the pathetic effort of a sweet old lady scraping together pennies in a jar, not as the very tip of a massive financial iceberg. "How?" Grace whispered in shock. "From where? Where did you get that kind of money?" "From my work," I answered. And for the very first time in my life, I allowed a deep, fierce pride to show in my voice. From the 45 years I spent my nights hunched over a heavy sewing machine, the custom wedding dresses, the expensive party gowns, the intricate baptism outfits, from the hard work you two always thought was just a silly little old lady's hobby, just something to keep me busy so I would not bother you. That little hobby paid for every single imported tile in your luxury kitchen. Frank was the first to compose himself. The initial shock quickly gave way to a brand new kind of cold calculation in his eyes. He was quick. I really had to give him credit for that. If he could not win by pure intimidation, he would try to win through a negotiation. Okay, he said, holding both of his hands up in a sign of surrender. We did not know. I swear to God, we had no idea, Martha. We genuinely thought you were struggling to get by. If you had just told us... Look, this changes absolutely everything. It is just a massive misunderstanding between us. Tell me, how much do we owe you? We will sit down and run the numbers together. We will pay you back every single cent with interest. But please, let us just go inside and talk about this like civilized adults. He truly believed he had figured out the core problem. He honestly thought this was just about a financial debt. He thought he could quantify my power, reduce it to a simple number on a spreadsheet, and by doing so, regain control of it. He had absolutely no idea, and that was exactly where the second revelation, the truly devastating one, was about to drop. I stepped outside onto the porch, pulling the front door firmly shut behind me. I sat down on the top step, the exact same spot where Richard and I used to sit and watch the summer rain fall over the neighborhood. With a simple wave of my hand, I invited them to sit down on the lower steps. They hesitated for a moment, but they obeyed. Now I was physically towering right over them. The movers, sensing that this dramatic standoff was going to take a while, walked back over to their truck to smoke a cigarette, keeping a very respectful distance from the porch. You do not owe me a single thing, Frank, I began, and my voice was incredibly soft, because this is not about a debt. You cannot possibly pay back what has no price tag. Do you really think this is just about a few $1,000s? Do you actually think the problem here is the kitchen money? He nodded slowly, looking very cautious. It is about so much more than that. It is about what this money truly represents. I paused, looking directly into my daughter's eyes. Grace, do you remember when you were away in college, how you constantly used to complain that your father was so incredibly cheap, that he barely gave you enough money to cover your textbooks? She lowered her head, blushing deeply with shame. I did complain about that, yes. Well then, your college tuition, every single one of your textbooks, your nice clothes, your fun nights out with your friends. All of that was fully paid for with the money I earned making custom dresses for the Sterling sisters. They both got married in the exact same year. I paid for your entire 4-year college education with just 2 wedding dresses. She stared up at me, her eyes wide open, her mouth slightly parted in total shock. And you, Frank, I continued, turning my focus to him. Your very first tailored suit for your first big corporate job interview, the one that brought you so much incredible luck. The one Grace specifically told you I had found on the clearance rack at some cheap department store. He frowned hard, clearly trying to remember it. I made that suit myself. I spent 3 sleepless nights sewing it by hand, using the absolute best English wool I could get my hands on. It was not on a clearance rack. It cost me the equivalent of 2 full weeks of my physical labor. You both built your careers, your entire adult lives, on the silent foundation of my little hobby. The air grew incredibly heavy. Their sheer crushing humiliation was palpable. But I was not finished yet. You think my power is just a few $1,000s tucked safely away in a bank account. You are completely delusional. Your ultimate dream is to buy a luxury condo downtown, isn't it? In that brand new building, the Parkview Tower. They glanced at each other, completely stunned that I knew about their private plans. Yes, Frank admitted quietly. We are saving up for the down payment right now. I offered a sad, thin smile. I saw the brochures on your desk. I went to the bank yesterday, but I did not go to withdraw the money for the kitchen. I went there to consolidate my main account, the account where I faithfully deposited cash every single week for 40 straight years. Frank, Grace, With the money I have sitting in that account right now, I could easily buy the condo of your dreams. Not just the down payment, the entire condo. I could pay for it in cold, hard cash. Tomorrow morning. And I would still have more than enough left over to buy the unit right next to it, and probably the one right above it, too. It was as if a massive bomb had gone off in total silence between us. Reality shifted violently right before their eyes. Their entire self-image, their extreme arrogance, their pathetic sense of absolute superiority, all of it crumbled into dust. They were not generous, successful benefactors taking care of a useless, elderly mother. They were just spoiled little kids living off a secret allowance they did not even realize they were getting. Grace started sobbing, but this time, there were no fake crocodile tears. These were deep, gut-wrenching sobs, ripped straight from the very bottom of her shattered soul. It was the devastating sound of an entire lifetime of delusions completely collapsing. Frank, on the other hand, turned as pale as a ghost. His eyes darted frantically from me to the house to the towering pile of cardboard boxes, as if he were desperately trying to comprehend the entirely new dimensions of the universe. And then he made his final, desperate play, the absolute lowest move of all. He turned to Grace and violently grabbed her by the shoulders. "Do you see this?" he hissed at her, with a toxic venom I had never heard in his voice before. "Do you see what she really is? A liar, a master manipulator? She lied to us our entire lives. She let us blindly believe we were broke. She let your father work himself into an early grave on a construction site while she was sitting on an absolute fortune. She is not a victim, Grace. She is a monster." It was a cowardly, pathetic attempt to deflect the blame, to paint me as the ultimate villain just to salvage a single shred of his severely bruised ego. But it did not work. Grace, peering through her heavy, blurry tears, looked straight at him and said something I never expected to hear. "No, Frank, the monster is not her, it is us." And with that, she slowly stood up, stumbling slightly on the concrete, and backed away from him. Their toxic alliance was completely broken. I sat there and let that sink in for a moment. The movers, who had heard absolutely everything, started loading the boxes into the back of the truck in complete silence, almost with a sense of deep reverence. Frank stayed sitting on the porch step, his head buried deep in his hands, a thoroughly defeated man. Grace was leaning heavily against a large oak tree by the sidewalk, crying silently into her hands. When the final box was loaded up, one of the movers approached me. "Where exactly are we taking all this, ma'am?" I looked over at Frank. He did not lift his head. I looked at Grace. She did not move an inch. They did not have a plan. They had absolutely nowhere to go. I sighed deeply. My revolution was not about sheer cruelty. It was about pure justice. And justice, sometimes, includes one final gesture of absolute clarity. I went inside to get my purse. I pulled a blank check from my brand new checkbook along with a pen. I walked over to the hood of Frank's car, and using it as a desk, I filled out the check. I walked up to Grace and held it out to her. "This is for both of you," I told her. She stared down at the piece of paper without reaching for it. "It is enough money for a security deposit on a nice apartment to buy some basic furniture and to live comfortably for 6 straight months without any financial worries. It is a clean break. This is the absolute last piece of help you will ever receive from me. After this, you are entirely on your own." She finally reached out a trembling hand and took the check. Her fingers were shaking violently. She looked down at the amount written on it, and her eyes welled up with fresh tears. It was a very generous amount. Beyond generous. "From now on," I continued, and my voice sounded exactly like a judge handing down a final sentence in a courtroom, "our entire relationship is going to change. If you ever want to see me, you will have to call me first. You will be guests, not residents. You will walk into this house as visitors, and you will treat me with the absolute respect that I deserve. If you cannot manage to do that, then we simply will not see each other anymore." The choice is entirely yours." Frank slowly stood up and walked over, staring hungrily at the check trembling in Grace's hand. His face was a twisted mix of deep humiliation and immense relief. The money, even though it was the ultimate symbol of his crushing defeat, was his only life raft. He did not say a single word. He just nodded, once, with a stiff, dry motion. I walked over to the mover and gave him the address of a local storage facility just a few miles down the road. "Drop everything off right there under their names. They will sort it out later." I paid them very generously for the job and for all the extra hassle. They climbed back into the massive cab of the truck. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a loud, rumbling noise that filled the evening air. Grace and Frank were left standing completely alone on the sidewalk, right beside their car, looking much smaller and far more fragile than ever before. The large moving truck pulled away down the street, taking with it every last physical trace of their life inside my home. I watched them for one final moment, just two complete strangers bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp. Then, I turned my back on them, walked up the steps of my porch, went inside my house, and firmly closed the front door. The heavy click of the new deadbolt snapping into place echoed perfectly through the hallway. It was the sweetest sound in the entire world. It was the beautiful sound of my absolute freedom. 6 months and 2 weeks passed by. That is the funny thing about time. When you are finally the master of your own minutes, it passes in a completely different way. It does not drag on forever. It does not weigh you down. It just flows smoothly like a calm, quiet river. That afternoon, my living room, the exact same room that had once been a silent, tense battlefield, was absolutely full of life. The deep midnight blue silk curtains filtered the bright afternoon sunlight, creating a beautiful atmosphere of total peace. Richard's crystal vase, filled with fresh roses straight from my garden, was the undisputed king of the coffee table, which was now permanently covered by my embroidered sunflower tablecloth. The whole house smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm apple pie, an old recipe from my mother that I had not baked in years. Sitting comfortably on the sofas and a couple of chairs I had brought in from the dining room were Helen, my neighbor, and 3 other wonderful women from our block. Mary, who lives right on the corner and always brings me fresh lemons from her tree. Sophie, a retired teacher, just like me, except she taught in a school, not with a sewing needle. And Carol, the owner of the small convenience store down the street. We had gotten into the lovely habit of meeting up like this, about once every 2 weeks, sometimes at my house, sometimes at someone else's. We playfully called it the Silver Thimble Club, a little inside joke that Helen had come up with. We would talk about absolutely everything and nothing at all. How grocery prices kept going up, how our garden plants were doing, funny stories about the grandkids. But sometimes, when a deeper sense of trust settled in with the very last sip of coffee, we would talk about much heavier things, about our quiet loneliness, about our hidden fears, about the small and massive injustices that life had unfairly thrown our way. That day, Mary looked over at me from behind her coffee mug. "You know, Martha," she said quietly, "the other day, my oldest son told me that it was high time I sold my house and moved into a smaller apartment, something a bit more manageable for an old lady. He said they would help me find a place closer to their house so they could take much better care of me." The rest of us simply nodded in silent understanding. It was a classic story we all knew by heart, just with a different cast of characters, but always following the exact same script. "And right then, I thought of you," Mary continued, and her eyes sparkled with fierce pride. I sat up perfectly straight in my chair, and I looked right at him. I said, "Listen here, Georgie. The day I can no longer walk up the stairs in my own home, I will have a fancy chair lift installed. And the day I can no longer bend down to weed my own garden, I will hire a professional landscaper to do it for me. But as for this house, the one your father and I built with our own 2 hands, the only way I am leaving is in a wooden box, And until that day comes, the only person who gets to make decisions about my life and my property is me. He just sat there completely speechless, as if he had never even considered that I was actually capable of answering him back like that. Helen smiled warmly. That right there is called setting a solid legal precedent, Mary. And it all started right here, she said, pointing toward the hardwood floor of my living room with a graceful sweep of her hand. Martha reminded all of us that getting older is not a synonym for simply surrendering. I felt a bright, warm flush rise up into my cheeks. I certainly did not feel like any kind of hero. I was just a woman who had finally gotten tired of being completely invisible. Right at that exact moment, the doorbell rang. It was a crisp, clear sound, completely lacking the frantic urgency or the blind rage from the last time I had heard it ring during a conflict. I found it strange, because I was not expecting anyone else to come over. I politely excused myself from my lovely guests and walked over to answer the door. As I peered out through the peephole, my heart stopped dead in my chest for a split second. It was Grace. She was standing out there all alone on the front porch, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as if she were freezing, even though the afternoon air was perfectly warm. She looked absolutely nothing like the furious woman who had screamed at me on my sidewalk just 6 months ago. Her hair, which was always styled to absolute perfection, was pulled back into a simple, messy bun. She was not wearing a single drop of makeup, and the dark, heavy bags under her eyes told a long story of very difficult, sleepless nights. Her clothes were incredibly plain, just a pair of faded blue jeans and a simple cotton blouse, completely replacing the sharp, expensive business suits she used to wear every day. She somehow looked much younger, and yet, at the exact same time, so much older. I took a very deep breath and slowly opened the heavy front door. She jumped slightly when she saw me, almost as if she truly had not expected me to actually answer. When her eyes finally met mine, they instantly filled with a heavy mixture of pure fear and deep shame. She stood there, completely speechless for a long moment, just staring at me. "Hello, Mom," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Grace," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I did not move a single inch from the threshold. The porch outside was neutral territory, but the inside of my home was no longer an automatic right. It was a very strict privilege. Can I come inside for just a minute? I promise I will not take up too much of your time." I hesitated. A small part of me, the deeply wounded mother, wanted to slam the door right in her face and never look at her again. But the new woman who had been reborn inside this house knew that true strength did not lie in petty revenge. It lied in having absolute control. And I was the one holding all the control. I took a slow step to the side. "My friends are sitting in the living room. We can go sit down in the kitchen." She nodded, looking incredibly grateful, and stepped inside as if she were walking onto sacred ground. She hurried past the living room, keeping her head bowed low so she would not have to make eye contact with my guests, who were all watching us with a very polite, quiet discretion. I followed her right into the kitchen. She sat down in one of the wooden chairs, the exact same chair where I had sat alone in the dark for so many nights, begging Richard's memory to tell me what I was supposed to do. I remained standing, leaning casually against the counter, right next to the coffee maker. I intentionally created a physical distance that perfectly mirrored the vast emotional distance that still existed between us. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" I offered her. It was a gesture of simple, basic courtesy, not one of motherly warmth. She gently shook her head. "No, thank you." She sat there nervously playing with the leather strap of her purse, not daring to look up at me. I really do not know where to start. "Start right at the beginning," I suggested. She took a shaky breath. "Frank and I are not together anymore," she blurted out, completely cutting to the chase. "We separated about 3 months ago." It did not surprise me in the slightest. Their marriage was never built on a foundation of genuine love. It was built entirely on mutual convenience and shared ruthless ambition. Without the comfortable safety net of my beautiful house and my hidden wealth, their toxic alliance had simply crumbled to dust. "He did not take it well," she continued softly. "Once the money from your generous check ran out, he started blaming absolutely everything on me. He said I had completely ruined everything with my big mouth. He told me that if I had not provoked you so badly that night, we would both still be living here, perfectly comfortable. One night, a really bad argument escalated, and it got incredibly ugly. I was genuinely terrified. The very next morning, while he was gone, I packed up my bags and I left." I nodded in absolute silence, slowly processing the new information. "Right now, I am living in a small rented bedroom over by my job. It is tiny, but it is entirely mine. I got a job working retail at a clothing store. The pay is not great, but it is enough to cover my basic bills." She finally looked up at me for the very first time, and I saw a raw, unfiltered sincerity in her eyes that I had not seen in years. "It is so hard, Mom. It is incredibly hard. Waking up and realizing that I am 35 years old and I do not have a single thing in this world to my actual name. Realizing that absolutely everything I thought I had proudly built myself, I had actually built while standing on the backs of your silent sacrifices, without even having the decency to know it. And why exactly are you coming here to tell me all of this, Grace?" I asked, and my voice came out much softer than I had originally intended. Because I just needed you to know," she said, and the heavy tears she had been desperately holding back finally spilled over her eyelashes and rolled down her pale cheeks. This time, there was absolutely no manipulation in those tears. They were the dry, painful tears of true regret. "I just need you to know that I finally understand. I finally understand everything. Every single time I complain about how much bus fare costs, I think about you taking that long ride downtown for 40 long years. Every time I have to sit down and stitch up a hole in my own socks because I cannot afford to buy new ones, I think about your tired working hands. I think about your silver thimble. Every single night when I sit all alone in that tiny, quiet, rented room, I think about how we so cruelly left you all alone in your very own living room. I am so sorry, Mom. I am so incredibly sorry that I was so totally blind, so selfish, and so terribly cruel to you. You did not deserve a single ounce of that." She allowed the heavy silence to settle between us. She did not try to step closer to me. She made absolutely no attempt to reach out and touch me. She simply offered up her vulnerable words, her genuine remorse, laying them out like a very fragile, delicate peace offering. I let her painful words truly reach me. They did not break me. They did not even make me cry. But they did manage to open a very small, hairline crack in the thick wall of solid ice I had built around my heart. I saw the sweet little girl I had spent my life raising, the bright young woman whose college tuition I had proudly paid for, completely lost beneath the hardened layers of the ruthlessly ambitious woman she had allowed herself to become. Perhaps that little girl was still in there, somewhere deep down. "Forgiveness is not just a simple word, Grace," I finally told her. "It is an action. It is a long series of actions, repeated day after day." She nodded, gently wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. "I know that. And I did not come here today to ask you to forgive me, and I certainly did not come here to ask you for a single dime. I came here to ask you for something entirely different." She looked straight at me, and the request she made was the absolute most unexpected thing I could have ever possibly imagined. At the retail store where I work, sometimes they get pieces of clothing that come in with minor manufacturing defects, a ripped seam, a missing button. The store manager usually just throws them in the trash. Yesterday we got this absolutely gorgeous silk blouse, but it had a tiny snag right near the collar. They were just going to throw it away. And I just thought about you, about how you always turn simple rags into beautiful treasures. I asked my manager if I could take it home instead. I brought it here for you." She reached into her purse and pulled out the blouse, which was folded with immense care. It was a stunning ivory color, made of incredibly fine silk. She held it out toward me. "I wanted to ask you if you might be willing to teach me how to fix it. I want to learn how to sew, Mom. I want to learn how to actually make something with my own 2 hands, something real." I looked down at the delicate silk blouse, and then I looked back up into my daughter's eyes. Her simple request was a very powerful metaphor. She did not just want to fix a torn piece of fabric. She wanted to learn how to mend her own broken life. She wanted to carefully stitch back together the bond she had so violently ripped apart between us. And that was a request that I could actually consider granting. I reached out and took the blouse from her. The luxurious fabric was incredibly soft to the touch. "Silk is extremely delicate," I told her, closely examining the small snag near the collar. "You are going to need a very fine needle, a very steady hand, and a whole lot of patience." "I have plenty of time," she answered quietly, "and I am more than willing to learn." I gave her a firm nod. "All right then. Come back here on Saturday afternoon, 4 o'clock sharp, and do not be late." It was the very first invitation I had given her to step foot back into my house, an invitation that came with strict conditions and a very clear purpose. It was the very first stitch in a brand new seam. She stood up from the chair, and a soft shadow of the sweet smile I remembered so fondly from her childhood appeared on her face. "Thank you so much, Mom. I will be here." I walked her back out to the front door. My friends had already slipped out quietly, leaving the living room perfectly tidy and silent. When Grace stepped out onto the front porch, she turned back around to face me. "Mom, that pie smells absolutely delicious." "It is your grandmother's old recipe," I told her. "Maybe, if you do a good job on Saturday, I will save you a slice." For the very first time in what felt like an eternity, we shared a genuine smile. It was a very small, timid smile, but it was incredibly real. I stood there watching her walk away down the street, heading not toward an expensive luxury car, but straight toward the city bus stop. And I truly felt that, just maybe, my daughter had finally started to find her way back home. Later that night, after I finished washing the dishes and wiping down the kitchen counters, I walked upstairs to my sewing studio. The small room smelled warmly of cotton threads and fresh fabric. It was the smell of my entire life. I sat down in front of my trusty old Singer sewing machine without turning it on. I just ran my hand over its cool, smooth metal surface. I thought about Richard. I thought about his glowing pride when he finally saw our house completely finished. I thought about his unwavering, absolute faith in me and in my art. What would he have thought about all of this? Honestly, I think he would have been angry, incredibly angry, not at me, but for me. Angry that it had taken me so many years to finally stand up and defend myself. But in the end, I know he would have been incredibly proud. Proud that the woman he loved so deeply refused to let her inner light be extinguished. That fierce strength he always saw shining inside of me, the strength that I myself had completely forgotten about, had finally stepped out into the bright light. I opened the small wooden drawer of my sewing machine and pulled out my silver thimble. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit me to absolute perfection, just like it always did. It was so much more than just a tiny piece of dented metal. It was my beautiful crown. It was my heavy shield. It was the ultimate symbol of a quiet, undeniable power that is built stitch by painful stitch, day after long day with endless patience and pure persistence. It is a kind of power that absolutely no one can ever take away from you, simply because they did not hand it to you in the first place. You earned it yourself. Grace and Frank's entire world was built on cheap appearances, on taking easy shortcuts, on fast cash, and totally superficial respect. They truly believed that real power came from a fancy job title, a luxury car, or an expensive downtown condo. They never understood that true power, the kind of power that actually lasts, is built from the inside out. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, knowing your true worth, and knowing what you are capable of creating out of absolutely nothing. I, Martha, just a simple seamstress, had built an impenetrable fortress using nothing more than a needle and a spool of thread. And from safely inside that fortress, I had fought my biggest battle. And I had won. Not with screaming or violence, but with the rock-solid calm of a woman who knows, without a shadow of a doubt, that the truth and justice are entirely on her side. Saturday rolled around and Grace arrived at 4 o'clock sharp. She brought a small notebook and a pencil, looking exactly like an eager, dedicated student. We sat down together at the large dining room table, bathed in the soft afternoon light. I patiently taught her how to properly thread the needle, how to tie a completely invisible knot, and how to make the tiny, incredibly precise stitches required to repair delicate silk. Her hands, which were so used to rapidly typing on a computer keyboard, were very clumsy at first. She pricked her finger a couple of times, but she never complained once. She just kept trying. And as we sat there quietly sewing in complete silence side by side, I felt that we were doing so much more than just repairing a silk blouse. We were slowly beginning to stitch back together, using a brand new, much stronger thread, the beautiful mother-daughter relationship that had been so violently torn apart. It was going to be incredibly long, highly delicate work, taken just one tiny stitch at a time. But for the very first time, I genuinely felt that it was worth the effort to try. The grandfather clock in the living room struck 7, my sacred hour. I stood up and walked into the living room. Grace stayed behind in the dining room, diligently finishing up her sewing lesson. I turned on the television. The dramatic, swelling music of crossed loves filled the room. I sat down on my large sofa, right in my favorite spot, and draped my knitted wool blanket over my knees. The main character of the show was still desperately fighting against her enemies, suffering terrible betrayals, and blindly searching for justice. But the dramatic storyline just did not grab my attention the way it used to. It honestly seemed a little too simple, a bit too exaggerated. I watched the screen with the detached distance of a woman who had just lived through a much more intense, real-life drama and had come out completely victorious. Real life, my actual life, had wildly surpassed fiction. I was living proof that you absolutely do not need to be rich or famous to have a story that is truly worth telling. Sometimes, the most important revolutions do not happen in grand palaces. They happen right in the living room of a quiet house, armed with a TV remote control and a tiny silver thimble. Sometimes the real hero is a 71-year-old woman who was cruelly told that she contributed absolutely nothing. I leaned my head back against the soft cushions of the sofa and smiled. The loud sounds of the television program blended perfectly with the soft, rhythmic scratching of my daughter's sewing needle, piercing through the silk in the next room over. It was a brand new kind of music. It was the beautiful sound of my absolute peace. My daughter had turned off my favorite show, and without even realizing it, she had turned on the greatest story of all, my own.